I'm really grateful to the two commentators. It's a very difficult undertaking to make comments on ideas that are particularly not in your own field. So they've done a lot of work on that, and I very much appreciate it. I'm here in order to reply, and I'll try and do that, but I'll try and, towards the end, I'll try and expand the reply into maybe a new discussion. That's what I hope will happen. So let me start with Aaron, since that's Aaron's comments. They're the ones that are most fresh in my mind at the moment. He started by raising a difficult question that I really don't have a formed answer to. And it's one where I think there's reasonable disagreement. I claim that duties of justice are necessarily owed to individuals, and then I argued on the grounds of the non-identity problem that meant that we as a nation or a generation don't have duties to people in duties of justice to people in future generations, because if we did something differently, those people would not exist. My argument was that you couldn't have infringed a person's rights by polluting if, had you not polluted, that person would not even have existed. You are not in a position to do anything better for that person by not polluting. Any attempt to do something better would prevent that person from existing even. And I took that as a good reason for thinking she didn't have a right held against you for not doing this pollution. But Aaron said, well, couldn't we think of the right holder as being something other than an individual or the individuals who live in future generations? He said, couldn't a right holder be a group? Well, yes, for sure, a right holder could be a group of people, but the problem we've got here is not merely that we're thinking about a group, but we're thinking about an entity composed of people, but composed of people in such a way that the same entity can exist when the people who compose it are different. That was a bit of a tongue twister. But think about a future generation as an entity. We can think of a future generation as an entity. It's composed of people. If we act differently now, the people the future generation will be composed of will be different people. But couldn't we say, well, we nevertheless owe duties to the future generation not to pollute, even though none of the people who constitute the future generation would have existed had we not polluted? Could it be that the right holder is not an individual who won't exist if we do something different, but a generation that will exist if we do something different, even though it will be made up of different people? I think that was the question that Aaron posed, and I think it's a good question. I think the answer is no, but I don't really have a good argument for it, because I must say I do think that certain entities that are not themselves people do have rights. So, for instance, I think that nations have rights. I think a nation has a right not to be invaded, for example, in most circumstances. And that's a right that belongs to the nation independently of the people who make up the nation. And if the composition of the people changes, the nation still holds the right. So that seems to me plausible for nations. It doesn't seem to me plausible for generations, the people who happen to exist in the future. And I've been asking myself, well, what's the difference? And there is a difference. The difference is that nations, the people who make up a nation, go together in a way that makes the nation plausibly count as an agent. We think that nations act. They act through their governments. Governments make decisions. We can think of the nation as making decisions. The nations undertake actions against other nations, and so on. So they're the sort of entity that's linked together in a way that gives them at least some of the qualities of an agent. And agents seem to be quite plausibly holders of rights. But a generation isn't an agent, it's just a mishmash. It's just a random collection. I shouldn't say random, it's just a set of people, not linked together with the sort of structure that allows it to act as an agent. So I think it's less plausibly a possible bearer of a right. But that's not a conclusive argument. That's just a way in which I would go if I had to try and make a conclusive argument. And that's at the moment the best I can do, I'm afraid. That was definitely an important question, and one that I should do more about. Another thing that Aaron said was if people couldn't, what I recommended as satisfying your duty of justice, could that not in fact solve the problem of climate change? I recommended offsetting your emissions, and he suggested, well, if everyone offset their emissions, wouldn't that solve the problem? Yes, it would. I mean, rather obviously it would solve the problem, because a bit of emission you do was done by anybody would be cancelled, because everything would be offset, so there would be no net emissions from that. So that certainly would solve the problem. I didn't recommend it as a way of solving the problem because I didn't think it was going to happen. That was the only reason. Very few people are going to do offsetting, however much I preach to them. In fact, that puts those of us who take any notice of this in a rather privileged position, because it's precisely because other people are not doing it that it's actually really quite cheap to do these days. If everybody started offsetting, the price of offsetting would go up. I think Aaron suggested the opposite to that, but I think that's not correct. Offsetting is very cheap at the moment because there's low-hanging fruit. There are, up until now, emissions of greenhouse gas have cost nothing. There's been no price on carbon emissions, and that means people have been emitting profligately all over the world. Our present economic setup is run by very, very profligate emissions because they cost nothing. And just because up to now they've cost nothing, it's very cheap to reduce them, particularly in countries where that hasn't yet started to a big degree. In developing countries where there hasn't been much reduction of emissions, offsetting there is very cheap, and because few people are doing it, it's cheap for those of us who do it to do it. But if everybody started doing it, it would become expensive, and then it would move towards solving the problem, because what's needed to solve the problem of climate change is for there to be a significant price on carbon. In fact, carbon to bear a price which is equal to the harm that it does. And if everybody started doing that, indeed the price would move up and move towards the real harm that it's doing, and that would be a solution to the problem. So the only reason I didn't recommend it as a solution is that I don't believe it's going to happen. The only thing that I believe, the only way that I think actually anything will happen is by action on the level of I was thinking of national governments, but I suppose we've got the example of California, which is a state government that's doing a lot, or sort of entities of the size of nations. It's going to take action on the part of entities of that sort, and indeed international agreement between them, in order actually to solve the problem. One other thing that Aaron asked me was, what would I think if the problem that we were faced had stopped being a problem of, as the technical term is, mitigating climate change, but had become a problem of adaptation. That's to say, if we hadn't solved the problem of climate change, people were suffering badly from it. would I still be saying the same things? And I think by and large, yes, I would. If you live in that world, which, as he says, may well be the world we've got, I still think that your duty of justice would require you to offset your emissions. I think perhaps what he was pointing out was that in a world like that, there would then be stronger duties of goodness incumbent on us, because there would be many more people suffering than there are in the world as we've got it at the moment. Already, it may well be that we bear duties of goodness towards those who suffer in this world to help them to at least an extent. And if there are more people suffering, then there would be heavier burdens on us to fulfill our duties of goodness towards them. But I still think that would be a separate duty from the one of justice, which would remain not to do emissions in the first place, even if everybody else is doing them to an unreasonable extent. Oh, and he also mentioned, expressed doubts about my proposal, which was to solve the problem of climate change by means which involved not harming anybody, making some people better off without anybody worse off. And the way of doing that, I said that would be achieved, could only be achieved by borrowing against future generations. And he thought that was morally rather dubious. And perhaps it is morally rather dubious. I'm not suggesting that this is the best solution, remember. I said I think that this is the solution that I'm now thinking of since I've become cynical about these things, and I don't think that the best solution is attainable. And at least, although it is placing a burden on the future generations, that burden will be compensated for by leaving them a cleaner atmosphere, more than compensated for, in fact. They will be better off because they'll have a cleaner atmosphere. It'll cost them because they'll have to pay back the loan which we've taken against them. In fact, what it would be doing, to put it in rather different terms, is we would be investing on their behalf for their own well-being. We would be making the investment in carbon reductions which are needed for their sake. And so they would simply be paying for the investments that we do for them. And that makes it seem not so bad, I hope. But I don't want to suggest that that solution that I was recommending, the one that I called the compensation plan, that one is a morally ideal solution. We don't live in a morally ideal world, and it may be, and it will be, if it happens, it would be better than not doing anything, but it wouldn't be very far from what we would do if we properly fulfilled our duty of justice towards people. And actually, I think that's what I want to come on to now. I want to come on to what Bill had to say. A week or so ago, after he'd sent me a draft of his talk, I wrote back saying to him that there was a lot of agreement, and that was nice because it meant that I would be able to focus on things we disagree about, and that would make for a better conversation. But actually, on hearing his speaking this morning, I've realized there's possibly even more agreement than I thought. And I feel so close, really, to achieving some harmony that I really wanted to pursue it. And I was actually very much cheered to hear him say that he didn't think there was much of a problem about debt, which I was thinking of as the main problem that stands in the way of putting things right. So I just want to pursue that and see if we can reach a full accommodation on this. I just want to learn, really, from him what he thinks about certain things. I thought I'd start by doing something that I now wish I'd thought of doing yesterday, which is drawing a diagram. Those of you who are economists, this will see this as a very familiar sort of diagram, and I hope most of you will have had some experience some exposure to these sorts of pictures that economists draw. And this is really meant to illustrate what I was saying yesterday, and I'm going to put Bill onto the picture at some point, and then he can tell me whether I put him in the right place or the wrong place. So I'm going to draw a picture that represents a distribution I was going to put the distribution of well-being, but I'm going to do it in a rather more economicsy way. I'm going to do a distribution of consumption between future people. So this is future consumption. Have I written big enough that you can see it towards the back, okay? And this is our consumption down here. And here is a picture of the possibilities that are available within technology. It would be quite hard to define exactly what I mean by that, but something along those lines. So it would be possible within the technology that's available or will become available in the future for the future consumption to be at this level and us to have none, or ours to be at this level and the people in the future to have none, or somewhere in between that. So there's a range of options available technologically for distribution of consumption between them and us, and this picture shows it. It shows that the availability of consumption for the future is greater than for the present. This distance is bigger than this distance, and that's because of what I call the fertility of production. Well, two things, actually. Development of technology, they'll probably have better technology, but also the fact that if you do investment, you get more back from the investment than you put in. That's how investment works. So by saving stuff in the present, we can deliver more goods to future people than we sacrifice in the present. So that's why the diagram looks like that. Now, where are we in the diagram? This is it's what's technically possible. And I take it it's technically possible to overcome the externality of climate damages. I'm going to put us into it in a moment.
I mean, the future consumption includes...
Oh, yeah, okay, good, sorry. Thank you. That's really why I wanted to put in well-being here to begin with, because I wanted this thing to be comprehensive and to include all the good things in life, including climate. That's right, thank you. Now, where are we at the moment? Well, it depends. I'm going to take no position on this. You could be an optimist or you can be a pessimist. Somebody who asked a question yesterday was evidently a pessimist. He thought that under business as usual, which is where we are nowadays, life in the future was going to be less good than life in the present. So he evidently thought we're somewhere down here where there's more consumption in the present than there is in the future. On the whole, the economic models are more optimistic than that. On the whole, the economic model suggests that economic growth is going to continue, and indeed life is going to get better in the future. So that puts us somewhere up here where future people are better off. I don't want to take a position, so why don't I take an intermediate point? Let me say that we are here. I'm annoyed by this splodge. Here, right? So that's business as usual. It's underneath the possibilities because we've got this externality of climate change, which is inefficient. That's to say, it's putting us in a position where it would be possible for some people to be better off without anybody worse off. And in fact, this picture now shows that very clearly because there's actually a whole range of places we could be where some people are better off and nobody's worse off. Anywhere along here, in fact, both the present generation and the future generation are better off. Here, we are better off and they're no worse off. They're better off and we're no worse off. So my recommendation was to try and get ourselves to somewhere in this range. So that's what I call the compensation plan, somewhere here. And that can be achieved in principle by having a price of carbon set up either by a carbon tax or by a cap and trade system, but in some way or other, assigning a price to emissions which is equal to the external harm that's done by those emissions. If you can get that price onto carbon somehow or other, and if there were no other externalities to worry about, if this was the only problem we had in the economy, then we would end up in one of these places here which are Pareto efficient, such that nobody can be made better off without someone else being made worse off. So that was my recommendation. As a sort of interim recommendation, the cynical recommendation to try and get things going. Now, my reading of the, well, let me take the Stern Review to start off with. My reading of the Stern Review is that what it's been looking for is the best place on this frontier here. Its aim was optimization. So it's making a judgment about the goodness of all these various different alternatives along here and claiming that one of them is the best. That could only be done by having some value function, we could say a social welfare function, that assigns values, at least puts all these points in an order, determines the ordering of points along there, and picks out whatever is highest in the order. And we can say that Stern comes here. Stern is quite keen on benefiting future generations. I've sort of exaggerated, but at any rate, Stern is up towards the top there. Now, my reading of Bill Nordhaus is that his view, his recommendation, is sort of somewhere a bit like this. It's not within this range that I call the compensation plan. It's outside that. Now, the evidence I've got for thinking that is that I found a place where you talk about working out what would be the best thing to do, constrained by the requirement that the consumption of present generations and generations for the next 40 years or so is not lowered. And that's the outcome there is different from the plan that's fully recommended in your work. And because it's different, that suggests that the plan that you really recommend is not within the range where consumption is not reduced at all. But it may not be very far away, because I think they're not really very different. So, but at any rate, and you can tell me whether that's right or not, somewhere in this range, there are various outcomes which I call the optimal plan. Yeah. No, I'm sorry, I can't. I wouldn't like to say where he comes. Perhaps somebody else can do that later. Now, okay, a little bit more about method, and then I come to ask the question. Now, so far as I can see, finding this optimal plan cannot be done unless you apply a value function, unless you evaluate the different alternatives and find out and decide amongst them which one is the best. And that does involve weighing the consumption of future generations against our own consumption, applying relative values to those two things and maximizing on the basis of that. And I do think that that's what Bill Nordhaus does. You find in his work a target, an objective function, something which is to be maximized, and he looks for a way of maximizing it. And that thing that's being maximized is a value function. I think he said, in clarifying it this morning, he talked about it as a Bergson-Samuelson social welfare function. But the truth is, whatever you call it, it has to involve the weighing of future people against present people. And I could put into this diagram something that represents the value function with that weighing built into it. And different people do their weighing in different ways. You can see the difference between Stern and Nordhaus as a difference between the shape of their value function. Obviously, let me put in some contours. I've written too much in. Let me get another color. I draw the contours of a value function here. Now, they're probably going to be, in fact, they're certainly going to have a sort of curved downward shape. They're going to bulge in this direction. That's because there are good reasons for favoring, to some degree, equality between consumptions of the different generations. The good reason for that is that you think the more consumption you get, the less benefit you get from consumption. So if you've got a given amount of consumption, it's better to distribute it equally between the generations rather than unequally, because if it's equally distributed, you get the most benefit coming out owing to this diminishing marginal benefit of consumption. So the optimum point is going to be where the contours of the value function, which are curved like this, touch that, and I put these ones are the Nordhaus ones that I put in, and they end up touching here. And you can see what will give you a different result. You can draw the contours more flat, and that will take you in this direction, or you can draw them less curved, and that will also take you in this direction. And that's what you find with Stern. Stern gives less value to equality in consumption between generations, and he also gives more value to future generations. So his curves are less curved and more level, and that's why he ends up here. So that's what I think is going on in those two authors. Now, here comes the question. I think we should try and set up institutions that allow us to get somewhere here, because that way I see movement. And I thought of that as posing a difficult problem, because getting to this point, as far as I can see, does involve borrowing against future generations in order to do investment for their sake, as I was just saying it. And I took that as a pretty serious problem, because it would involve a lot of borrowing, and the way that the present financial system works seems to prevent that. But Bill said, no, he didn't think there would be a big borrowing problem. Now, so this is my question. Why doesn't he think that? Well, here's my speculation. It's because he thinks that the externality is less serious than I supposed it was. He thinks that the social cost of carbon, that's to say the value of the harm that we impose on future people, is not so great as Stern thinks it is, and by and large I was following Stern. And that means that the cost of doing something about it is going to be less than I've assumed it is, following Stern. And of course, if the cost of doing something about it is rather less, that means you don't have to borrow so much money in order to do something about it, and maybe the cost of borrowing is the borrowing problem, the debt problem, is not so great on that account. Now, if that's the explanation, then I'm not quite so cheered about it, because it means that he thinks the problem is less because he has a more sanguine view about climate change than I do. And it still remains true that if climate change is really as damaging as I'm assuming it is, then we really will have a big problem of a big debt problem if we are to achieve the compensation plan. But let me say again, just to emphasize something I said yesterday, but perhaps without enough stress. I don't think this is ideal. I think this solution anywhere in here is not a good one. It involves a lot of injustice. I too would like to optimize. I would like to get to the best world, and I would have some sort of a value function which would take me somewhere up here. Because I'm not an economist, it's not my responsibility to pick a particular point up there, but it will be somewhere up there. I want to ask Bill what the answer to that question is, but if I may, just before I do that, there's one other thing I wanted to say. and this is about the other question that he brought up, the question of private morality. Just one particular point, actually, I want to mention. He thinks that we should have a price on carbon. I think we should all agree about that. There should be a price on carbon established some way or other. By a tax, he's in favor of, and that's the natural way for anyone with an economics training to think. He then suggested that if there was the appropriate tax on carbon, so that when you do something that causes emissions, you are paying an amount that's equal to the value of the harm that you're doing, then that should make this a morally neutral, put this in a morally neutral zone. This was an extension of the general idea about the market, that the market is morally neutral, which is sort of plausible, because in general, when you participate in the market, you're getting benefits, you're paying for the services and the goods that you get, you're paying for the effort that people put in, and you're paying a cost which is equal in value to the effort that they put in. And they are getting the money you pay. So they're being fully compensated for by the effort that they are making on your behalf because you pay for them. And the price that you pay is equal in value to the effort that they put in, and they're therefore no worse off, maybe better off, and you are better off. So that's a great thing to be said for a market. It does provide a moral neutrality in certain circumstances, if trading is ideal and so on. And I think Bill wanted to extend that thought to a situation where there's an appropriate tax price on any carbon emissions that you have. Although there was a caveat at the end. He pointed out that you pay the right price, but the people who are suffering the harm do not receive the compensation for it. So what you know when you pay your taxes is that what you're deciding to do is being properly costed. And if you decide to do it, then it's worth the cost, so that the benefit to you of whatever you do that implies emissions is sufficiently great that it's worth those emissions. It covers the cost of the emissions. And I think he was suggesting that means that you don't have to worry about the morality of it. I think you do still have to worry about the morality of it. Because although you are willing to pay enough, and you do pay enough to cover the harm that's being caused, the people to whom the harm is being caused are not being compensated for the harm. You are, in fact, still harming them. That's not so when you buy a good in an ordinary market. They will be compensated for the harm that they suffer in working for it. When you pay a carbon tax, nevertheless, although you're paying, that you are not compensating the people who suffer. Of course, if your government was clever enough to distribute compensation to the people, that would be fine. But actually, it doesn't. It uses the tax in other ways. So it continues to be true that you harm people by your emissions. And I think, therefore, it continues to be true that the duty of justice requires you to offset your emissions. So this is another hard saying. Even if you live in a country where there is an ideal carbon tax, that does not excuse you from the duty of justice to offset any emissions that you cause.
Whiteboard here because I think it's most efficient. So I think this captures actually many of the things very nicely. And I'll try to find a... Okay. Find something that you can see and is different. Okay. All right. So this really, I think this is a really nice diagram. And I would say, for those of you who like diagrams, I love diagrams. This actually captures, everything. For economists, we only work in one dimension. We only can use two variables at a time. And this really, it's just our minds are very limited, but if you get the right diagram, you actually can do a lot. Okay, so let me just say, I think this really captures it. First, you have consumption. When I do this, I use that term also, and I want to emphasize this is what I call comprehensive consumption. It includes market, non-market. It includes valuation of environmental services. If you want to think of deep ecology, I suppose you could try to put that in as well. But the main thing to recognize is this is comprehensive. And so, in particular, if you think that climate change is going to reduce yields in agriculture, that's accounted for here. So I think that's clear. Secondly, you have the trade-off. That's to say this is downwards. So this is a consumption possibility curve, as we call it. It's downward sloping. It's bowed out, but that's not critical. It has a slope steeper than 1. If that reflects the productivity of investment. It has very important in this way of thinking of it is that the future looks as if it's got higher consumption possibilities than the present. That is the feature of every single economic model in this area, including the Stern Review. Doesn't mean it necessarily will happen, but the discourse in which this takes place is one in which you think of future generations as benefiting from technologies. I actually emphasize health technologies when I think of the biggest single thing I would not want to give up. So I ask, if I could go back 50, if someone said you have to go back and live 50 years ago, what would you not give up of today's technology? I say health. That's absolutely number 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'd give up all my iPods and everything if I could keep health technologies. So that's a very important part of it, and we've seen it in improvements in life expectancy and so on. Okay. Now, so then we have the business as usual point, and the idea here being that that's what's inside the exact. I'm just repeating, just putting in. Just to emphasize, it's inside the frontier because of inefficiencies, in this particular case, climate externalities. Then we have what I think of as the Pareto region here, which is those are in principle places where you could improve the consumption of both future and present generations. Of course, you can do this multidimensional. If you can think in 3 dimensions, you could have 3. And then you could have 3 generations, and you'd have a plane and so on. But like, hello, who needs that? So this is fine. Okay, so now here's where we're going to go a slightly different direction. So I think John is correct to say that the policies that were emphasized in the Stern Review and in my work were ones that we're up here to the northwest of the Pareto region, using the techniques that we used. But there, I think then we're actually going separate routes. I don't actually know whether. So one of the things about the Stern recommendation notice is that you have lower consumption of the current generation, relatively poor generation, and higher consumption of the relatively rich future generation. And I just at the outset, I part ways with that. I don't know the extent to which the Nick Stern or the team thought that was an essential part of it, rather than other issues such as interest rates and discount rates, but I don't think that's important for our purpose. Now, in my own work, if I could rewind the clock 20 years, I would have written this differently. I would have emphasized differently, which is that there are 2 kinds of things going on here. One is going to the frontier, which you can think of as climate policy, and then where you are on the frontier, which is distributional policy. Now I'm just going to blow up that little triangular region, like this. So this is just blow that up. So this is where we are here. And now my view is that, okay, let's say you're tightening the screws in climate policy. So you do, let's just say 10 units of climate policy, you go here, and 20 you go here, and 30 you go here. But then you overdo it and you actually start coming back, 40 here, 50 here, 60 here, and you can actually end up, if you like shut down everything, and you could actually end up worse off. And what I've been trying to figure out is what this point is. Now, it turns out that actually what that point is going to depend on what your time preference is and the market discount rates are. And so actually this number, which I said is, say, 30, if you use different kinds of assumptions, first place you go off in a different direction, but you might have a higher number. So you might end up, instead of 30, you might end up with, say, 300. So it might be because you're weighing the future much more heavily than the present, or you're discounting the future much less heavily than in one case than the other. You'd actually weigh the benefits a lot more, and you'd end up with a more tightening of the screws. Okay. So I think that's one difference. It's a genuine difference, and it has to do with discounting. But I think that's not what this was about. What this was about was the second issue is, let's say, so I just talk about my own case. So when I did this calculation, I'd say, okay, that's how you get up here. I did a little differently. But it turns out that to a first approximation, once you get to the frontier is pretty flat. And you can redistribute by using taxation or rebates. So let's say you get here by a tax. Well, if you want to stay there, you don't rebate the tax, and you're reducing consumption. However, if you don't think that's a good idea either for political or for ethical reasons, you say, okay, I'm going to rebate some of the tax. And the more you rebate, the more you go down here, because the more people have income, the more income people have, and the more they would consume, and therefore the more they consume, and the less you have to go up in this northwest direction. So I think this is something I said in my talk, that this is something that has actually not been emphasized, and if I rewind the clock, I would have, although I think actually it took me quite a while to figure this out. So I didn't really know this until somebody asked me this well after I'd done the original work. But I separate out what I'll call the efficiency aspects of getting to the frontier from the distributional aspects of how you distribute the burden of that among the different generations. And so I don't actually see that. I think it's just not a big issue. I don't see the difference, and I think it's a kind of natural kind of thing you're going to do as a government. If you tax, you're going to have to decide what to do with the revenues, whether you're going to rebate them or not. And final point on the debt. I'll just say this again, but maybe I'll sum up here. It's actually easy to do. So we have a certain amount of national income today, and we can divide it between consumption today and what I'll call investment in, let's call S for standard kinds of things, and investment in climate kind of things. So these would be investments in, say, renewables, or in natural gas rather than coal. This would be investment in the University of Michigan human capital, faculty salaries, or it could be investment in computers, computation, infrastructure, you name it, all the kinds of other stuff. Now, I think you should think of this in the short run as given by your technology and your inputs. And so now let's assume that you want to hold the first period's consumption, the present generation's consumption constant, which is, you might say, one possible. You could increase it, but let's say you want to hold it constant. Then basically what you're doing is your decision about climate policy is really about how you're going to distribute the balance, which is the investment, between investment, so standard investment, human capital, research and development, plant, equipment, so on, and climate mitigation investments. And so this is rather, if you look at the real economy, real as in the macro economy, this is the trade-off that we face. Now, the question, so you might say, well, if you do that, does that going to have an effect on the balance sheet of governments? So what is the implication, question mark, on the government debt? Well, my sense, and I thought about this a fair amount, is that to a first approximation, there's no effect. Because if you're raising revenue and then you're rebating it, which is the example, and I'm just going to be a little technical, but it's not too painful, you're going to keep the disposable income of households the same. In general, you will change relative prices of goods and services, carbon and non-carbon goods, but you'll keep the disposable income, the after-tax income of households the same. You generally would expect that the consumption would therefore stay the same, leaving the amount of investment available the same. And with a given output, you wouldn't need to do any other thing to promote that. Now, if in fact it were the case that this switch from income taxation to consumption taxation of carbon were to reduce consumption, you would then need to, say, reduce income taxes a little more, and that would lead to more debt. But A, I don't think there's any presumption whether that would occur, that would occur, and B, it would be small relative to debt. But the main thing is, I think, what I would look at, if you want to ask what the real impact is, it's the impact on the composition of national investment between climate-type investments and all other type investments. And the more you turn the screws on that, this would be going up and that would be going down. And the real, I view the real as in not dollars, but looking at the real impact is what the balance is in which how much you want to increase this and lower that. Assuming for the moment we're having the compensation principle, which I think is, for lots of reasons, a fine idea. I agree with that on ethical grounds. I agree with that on political grounds, bargaining grounds. Everything you said, just to back up a little, everything we know about bargaining says if you want to bargain between two parties, don't send it off in like that direction. Always send it northeast, so everybody says, I'm benefiting from this. You can bargain about where you're going to be on that curve, but you don't want to say you're a loser. Sign this piece of paper that says I am a loser. Sign William Nordhaus. That's not a good approach to bargaining. So I hope that answered.
Hello, I'm Roger Harrabin, BBC environment analyst, visiting as a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan, having a great time, and this is fantastic. But I have so many questions. I'll confine myself to one, which is on the question of investment here. Now, just looking at your little diagram there, I would assume from that your standard investment, or your IS, whatever that stood for, will be in the sort of things that will increase consumption now in the broadest sense. So suppose if you were investing, if you had a health system like the UK, you would be investing, say, in new hospitals. And if you use debt to invest in new hospitals, that would therefore improve quality of life now and life expectancy, therefore would increase consumption. So whereas your investment in climate change mitigation would just bring you more expensive clean energy, which would not benefit future generations in terms of consumption. Therefore, it seems to me that there, unless I've misunderstood, that is not a neutral equation, because there is a loss in current consumption.
Just the last thing you said.
Yes, it wouldn't, well, the IC, the investment in climate change mitigation, does not bring you an improvement in current consumption because green energy is more expensive than dirty energy.
So real quickly, both of them increase future consumption, right? But remember, the way climate investments increase future consumption is by reducing future damages. So let's say you think that unchecked climate change is going to bring health. In John's lecture yesterday, he talked particularly about the health effects. So they're going to bring health effects. So you can reduce future health damages either by investing in standard things, which are, say, research and development and biomedical technologies and so on, or you can do it by climate change investments, which are going to slow climate change and thereby lead to less health damages in the future. That's actually great. I think that was a great example because you say, okay, well, which one is a better investment? Well, my view is they're both good investments, and I think I would probably I would definitely want to do some climate, but I might not want to do as much as other people, and I definitely want to do more than some people. But they're both designed to increase future consumption of the comprehensive kind that includes health and so on. Okay, enough.
There's
Hi, I have a question for Professor Broome. So you said that nations are different from generations because nations can be conceived of as agents and generations can't. And you suggested that agents have rights, or agents are the kinds of things that can have rights, but non-agents don't have rights or aren't the kind of thing that could have rights. And I was thinking that maybe you can think of a position or a role as an agent separately from thinking of the occupier of the position or role as an agent. So for example, you might be able to think of the Pope as an agent. You might be able to think about a person, well, you might be able to think of the president as an agent. You can even distinguish between the way in which you think of Obama, let's say, as a president, as an agent. That agent, let's say, doesn't believe in marriage equality, whereas perhaps Obama qua person does believe in marriage equality. You could think about the defendant's lawyer qua lawyer as believing that the defendant is innocent, whereas the person who occupies that role doesn't believe that the person is innocent. And I guess I don't see why you can't think of your great-great-great-grandchild as an agent in that role-centered kind of way without knowing whether your great-great-great-grandchild is Alice or Bob or someone else. So it seems to me that you could bear rights to people in virtue of bearing rights, bear an obligation to respect someone's rights in virtue of the role that they'll occupy without having to worry about the non-identity problem.
Yes, certainly. Is this work? I think I'd like to pursue it further. I think this idea of a role as bearing rights, we can forget about the role as agency. That was only a step in the argument. Could we think of rights as attaching to a role rather than to a person? I would like to investigate that some more. So I like the example of the president. So could we think that the president has a right, to make it analogous with the future generation case, could we think that the president has a right to your doing something which is such that if you did it, that person wouldn't be president, right? There would be another president in place. Now, I don't know, and I think it would be worth figuring it out, as a matter of fact. So, I mean, I couldn't think of a more concrete example, but you're a voter, say. So suppose that as a voter you have some duties towards the president, not the individual who is the president, but towards the president. Could it be that those duties require you to do something that would ensure, suppose you don't do it, could it be that the duties required you failed to do something you should have done? Could it have been that what you failed to do was such that, had you done it, you would have had a different president? I really don't know the answer, but I think it would be worth figuring it out, and it would be a nice test case for this idea that you could owe a duty to members of a future generation in their role as members of a future generation rather than as people. I don't know the answer. Thank you.
This is for Professor Broome, though. I'd be interested in what I mean, all of you would have to say about it. So, as I understood your argument of yesterday, the reason not to go for an optimal solution is because we aren't going to be able to do it. And the idea is we'll try for some efficient solution in the little area of the curve there, because that's one of the things that sort of is possible. And I guess the question I'm interested in, so if we think of this as kind of a bargaining problem, current generations versus sort of generations in the future, I'm curious why it won't turn out if we're able to borrow from the future sort of to compensate ourselves for not consuming as much carbon. Why we wouldn't, as the current generation, sort of demand the best price we can get, which is to say we'd end up, sort of just above the point there where the at the lower sort of corner of the triangle there, So we each agree to take one fewer trips to Paris in our lifetimes or something. But in compensation, we want really good French food. And so we're able to borrow against the future generations. And so I guess I'm curious why, given that we are doing the bargaining here, why the result isn't going to be just this very marginal improvement for them and this increased consumption for us.
Yeah, I'm curious too. And actually, this is something I meant to say. What was driving this, everything I was saying, was noticing that we're not getting an agreement. And the question is, why not? I mean, we didn't have a problem with dealing with the ozone hole. We got an agreement on CFCs really rather easily and very effectively, and it's actually working. Now, according to the pictures we've got up here, there should be a solution available to the international process which is good for everybody. And how come then that we're not getting there? You would think that those bargainers would actually be keen to achieving a result. And since this is just a matter of handing out the goodies that result from dealing with climate change, why hasn't that happened? Now, maybe I was wrong in understanding it this way, but what I thought was going on was that they don't realize that they're handing out the goodies. They think that they're handing out sacrifices. So at the UNFCCC meetings, that's what they talk about. They say, how much is the states going to sacrifice? How much is China going to sacrifice in order to bring about this good result for the sake of future generations? I mean, that seems to be the way that they think, and they're not going to take those sacrifices. So I thought, well, shouldn't they be thinking in this other way? They should be recognizing climate change is an externality. We can fix it in a way that's good for all of us, and that means actually literally everybody in every generation. Why haven't they been thinking that way? Now, for myself, I thought the other way. I thought we've got to make a sacrifice and we've got to figure out how much, until it was pointed out to me, no, we don't. And actually, Bill just said that when he first thought about it, he thought about it as moving in a sort of leftward direction, but then he realized once you're there, well, you could perfectly well move up and down the frontier, even to the Pareto position. So it took me a while to realize, possibly it took him a while to realize, it certainly took Nick Stern a while to realize. Well, this is a significant realization, I think, and it's something that should be brought to the attention of the international community. This can be done in a way that involves no sacrifice. Now, let me say again, I think we should make a sacrifice because I believe the optimization conclusions, which are that we should be making a sacrifice. But I think it would be a good idea if the international community realized that no sacrifice was necessary. And to a lot of people, that just comes as a surprise.
Can I just say one Laura, could I small comment on that?
Yes, please.
So I basically agree with that. I think the point about not being a sacrifice is highly aggregated in this generation, this world, everybody thrown together, not worrying about whether I drive a lot or don't drive very much and so on. So, but it is very aggregated and abstract in this sense. But I do think it's an important point. The way I've come to look at it is this is a horrible, horrible prisoner's dilemma, plus free riding. And it's not just the normal kind of prisoner's dilemma of we as a nation would make investments. We would divert from our domestic investments to some global. So this is I'll just say this equation is oversimplified because it assumes that the investment is for the IC is for us, whereas in fact it's for the globe as a whole. So we as a nation would actually get only a small fraction of the benefits from our investments in IC, whereas we get most of the investments in the standard kind of investment. So that's the one prisoner's dilemma where we all would obviously like not to do that, and the non-cooperative equilibrium is to do nothing. And if a few other people do it, then we're allowing to free ride on it or cheat on misstate our investment. There's another prisoner's dilemma, which is the time one, and that is it's the present and the deep future, because the benefits of this, what the people who are going to take action now are the people today, and the people who are going to benefit are not just the globe, but way in the future. So we've got that as well. And those two actually make it, I think, part of what make it a particularly difficult problem.
Give some signal in addition to asking a question. Sarah's up next.
I just want to ask a question about why it's permissible to borrow against future generations so that we reduce emissions. Because basically my question is, when someone comes to collect the debt from 2162 Sarah, knocks on the door, says, you owe me $500. My question is, why is it fair that she should pay the $500? And one candidate answer is, well, of course it's fair because her life's better than it would have been otherwise. She's got cleaner air, fewer storms, longer life than if we hadn't reduced emissions. More than fair. It's like she's getting a really good deal. It's only $500. Certainly, if I came to you and I said I could do all this stuff for you, make your life better in all these ways, let's just suppose that I could reasonably expect $500 from you for enacting that kind of plan. But it's a bit tricky because that can't quite be the answer because, of course, it's not the case that if we'd kept polluting, she would have had dirtier air, more storms, and a shorter life, because in fact, if we kept polluting, given chaos and the nature of conception, she just wouldn't have existed at all. So I guess what I'm curious about is that it seems like the non-identity problem makes it a little tricky to just generalize my normal thinking about what makes it fair to ask for compensation. So unlike normal cases, I can't justify asking for compensation by asking things like, oh, how much would you have paid me to reduce emissions? Or how happy are you that I reduced emissions? Because of course her answer is going to be way more than $500 happy, because I wouldn't have even existed if you hadn't reduced emissions. And I don't want to pay attention to that answer, because then we go down this road of demanding more than $500 from her. And even if we keep polluting, we'd be justified in demanding more than $500 from those people who don't even get the clean air in the bargain. So I'm just kind of curious about how you're thinking about the compensation relation in light of the whole non-identity problem.
I never said it was fair. In fact, I particularly said it was unfair. I said that those solutions are unjust, and they perpetuate the existing injustice in the world. So I don't think it's fair. And this is all to do with improving the world, to getting to a better position than it will be if we don't do it. Nothing to do with fairness at all.
Sorry, I'm meant to target it, Professor Nordhaus. It seems more broad compensation plans than I think they
sorry, I can't hear what you're saying, to be honest.
She wanted me to comment on it too.
Oh, sorry. Good.
Well, I just, first place, I think I said there is no debt. I want to be clear that if you asked what the net debt status is of a plan, the compensation plan, which kept current generations at their same level of consumption or well-being, my best guess would be the effect on debt would be zero. Not to say there wouldn't be no debt, we're going to have mountains of debt, but the effect on the debt would be zero. But I think you raise a good, but I think what you would, I think you're looking on the wrong side of the balance sheet. You should look on the real side rather than the debts, the dollar side. The real side is, yes, you are leaving with more climate capital, meaning more emissions reduction capital, and you are leaving with less other capital, less human capital, less research and development, less renewable power, well, less factories of different kinds, less pizza factories and things like that. So I think that is the real question. What is the balance between those two? But so there's a debt, but it's not a dollar debt or not a paper debt. And it's what we're in a sense doing is we're saying we're putting. So this non-identity problem doesn't bother me that much. I look at the future generation or many of them. I don't. They're statistical individuals for me. I don't know who they're going to be, the Sarahs or the Johns or the Aruns. And I say, well, okay, are we improving their well-being by what we're doing? And I think the answer is yes. Moving toward the frontier, we're improving their well-being, or potentially improving their well-being. And we're certainly improving overall. But you can overdo things as well. My view of the Stern Review's solutions was they were overdoing it, and they had actually gone to the frontier and moved back a little. But those are kinds of things like you can do the algebra yourself and do the modeling yourself, and I can easily get the Stern numbers if I do some things on damage functions and so on. But the key point is it is a choice about what kind of world, from an economic point of view, what kind of capital structure we want to leave our children, because they're the ones who are making the next set of decisions. And do we want to leave a lot of emissions abatement equipment? Do we leave none, as some people would say? Do we want to devote all of our investment to that? Well, I think the answer is obviously between the extremes, and it's a tough question. But the more important question is, how are we going to do this? And what kinds of mechanisms are we going to put in place, whether it's cap and trade or carbon tax, or then or some really inefficient suite of regulations, or do nothing. Anyway, but I think the debt is I've said this 3 times. I'd be glad to say more, but I think it's something you can sleep tonight without worrying about the debt of whatever you think we should do about climate change policies, because I think that's just the very tiniest part of the problem.
We have 5 people in our queue and about 15 minutes left. Of course, we could continue discussion over lunch, but I'm going to encourage questions and answers to be lean.
So this is sort of in the spirit of something Aaron suggested. So it occurs to me that I think there's another aspect of the public morality of climate change that hasn't really been addressed due to the largely individualistic focus. So if we think more holistically about the human species and its development over time, it seems to me that that is something that we have some kind of investment in the same way that people can care about the development of their nation. And if we think about that, I think that may provide one explanation of why we find it bothersome, the idea of, say, depleting natural resources, where people in the future, although their lives are worth living, they're not nearly as well off as a different set of individuals might have been, is that we've impacted the direction that the human species has taken in a way that is bothersome. So even if it's the case that the individuals of those of the depletion generation wouldn't have existed otherwise, we could still be bothered by our actions and the way that we've taken the direction of the species. So I'm just wondering what you think about this kind of consideration, these holistic considerations. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with what you've said. It's just there may be more to say. Yeah, mostly directed to John.
There are a lot of bad things about climate change. And I have concentrated on the bad things that happen to individuals. Or that, I shouldn't say that, not bad things that happen to individuals, but the good and bad of the individuals. The distinction is meant to encompass the fact that there might be different individuals existing. I do also think that there's such a thing as the good and bad of humanity as a whole, or I'm at any rate willing to believe that, and there might be such things as the good and bad of nature, shall we say. So there could be, I'm happy with the idea that there are goods and bads that do not belong to the people. And this holistic one, the shape of the development of humanity, I've got nothing against it. I mean, I don't insist on that as being valuable, but I, at the moment, have nothing against it. So can I just leave it at that?
I'd like to address something that you've touched on, all of you, but not really discussed in detail, and that's the uncertainty that's inherent in our climate projections. Certainly, the price we need to put on carbon to achieve this Pareto optimum, and from an ethical point of view, the amount of injustice we do to future generations is going to depend very radically on just how harmful a given kilogram or ton of CO2 going to the atmosphere is. One thing that future generations will have that we don't have will be a much better assessment of the harm that CO2 emissions do. So they'll be in a better position to more efficiently allocate their resources to mitigating or eliminating the effects of CO2. And I'm wondering, both from an economic standpoint and from an ethical standpoint, what are the ramifications of our realization that uncertainty will decrease as a function of time?
Okay, that's very difficult. But I've certainly seen a good case made for saying that the pressure that the world is putting itself under at the moment to do something about emissions quickly may be a mistake, because the problem with carbon dioxide is a problem of the amount of the stock of the stuff that's in the air rather than the flows that happen at any particular time. And it makes little difference whether a ton is emitted now or is emitted in 20 years' time. So it may be that what we should do is fix our attention on the stock and recognize that we will know more about the harm that it's doing in the future. So we should plan in a way that allows options and not necessarily press very hard to get reductions now, instead make it possible to make reductions in the future if that turns out to be necessary. I think there might well be an argument for that.
Could I just briefly, this is a tough subject, and I'd say we have been working in the climate change economics on this for maybe 20 years, but it's still, we're struggling. The tools that are used are ones that should be familiar to people here. They're using subjective probability to try to assess the uncertainties because we don't have any historical evidence. We use something like von Neumann-Morgenstern type utility functions as a way of ranking social states. Then we run those through these large models I talked about. So you start with your 20,000 lines of code and you add a few more thousands to that. And then you can do, and then in addition you could, that's about where the state of the art now is. But then there's a question of how fast the uncertainties are resolved, and kind of Bayesian learning, if you like. And that's actually, I think we're working on that. The people in this area are working on that, and it's a very tough problem. I'd say at this point it's kind of a standoff between what I'll call the learning effects and the risk aversion / nonlinearities as to which of those is dominating. So if you start with a certain equivalent policy and then add these features, I'd say at this point we don't quite know the sign of how that would change things. Our intuition is that it would probably make you want to do more now, but that's a part of unformed intuition, because there's not much intuition on the role of on how Bayesian learning will affect things. So that's a really interesting, and I know that a lot of people in your departments are working on these issues. It's a really interesting and important question.
Can I add one more thing to it about the stocks versus flows, which is that I think a lot of people have remarked on the inertia of the climate system, which is to say that once you have a certain level of the stock, the effects of that will unfold over probably 1,500 years. So if you remove a certain amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you will not see the immediate impacts of that happening. But in addition to the inertia in the climate system, there's also a huge amount of inertia in the physical infrastructure that we have today. So if you don't take actions today to reduce the flow of carbon emissions, and you begin to take actions 20 years from now, it'll be 30, 40, 50, 60 years. That is the lifetime of different kinds of energy-producing physical infrastructure that will unfold much more slowly than your decision at some political level to reduce emissions. In addition to that, you have a huge amount of inertia in the social and institutional system. So you can pass policies or you can change prices. People don't immediately respond to them. There's some delta that happens as a result of that, but the full effects of that don't happen immediately. So I'm not entirely convinced that so there are two things. One is that it is not urgent or it is not important to try to reduce emissions now, the flow of emissions now. Because if you look even between 2008 and 2011, the emissions have gone up from 29 billion tons of carbon dioxide to 34 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that's taking into account the economic crisis that happened in the middle. But if you try to think about how you are going to reduce it, each of these additional billion tons of carbon dioxide, 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide adds another part per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and without any sense of how this will actually come out. So I'm actually not convinced that one can ignore the continuing and increasing, faster than projected increases in the levels of emissions which are continuing to add to the stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
This is a question for Professor Broome. I find very interesting the proposal that we could reframe our problem to say that we can achieve adequate or at least vastly superior climate policy at no cost. My worry is that I think that there's an additional sort of cynical reason why people are not going to accept your frame, and that has to do with endowment effects. So we know that people insist on being paid a lot more to give up on something they already have than they are willing to pay to get that very thing. And I think that makes our ideas about compensation, it raises the demands on compensation, because what people are going to demand to be compensated to change their habits is going to be actually much higher than they would have ever been willing to pay to get into these bad habits in the first place. And so I think it's going to be very difficult to convince people that you can have full compensation with, you have a full 100% rebate on a carbon tax. They won't feel it that way. Now, my own opinion, speaking as a moral philosopher, is that this is almost entirely the effects of illusion. That is that a preference accounting of welfare is not really a very good accounting at all. and that there are better measures of welfare under which there really would be no losses, and that preference accounting, because it incorporates all these illusions, it's kind of like money illusion. It's very hard to get people out of it, but it seems then that you would need additional arguments to get people to think about their welfare in some other terms than just, my current preferences. You have to give additional arguments, for instance, as to why, if they were to give up their SUVs and other things that would now be beyond reach, that in fact, in reality, their lives will be just perfectly fine, that they can live perfectly happily without these highly carbon-intensive consumption goods. But that requires a sort of different argument and a more normatively loaded argument than just the idea that, hey, we can 100% rebate a carbon tax and you'll be just as well off as before, because they won't feel it that way.
You're right that the theorem, if I can call it that says an externality is Pareto inefficient, does depend on assuming that people have one set of preferences rather than two sets of preferences according to whether they're giving something up or getting something new. So I'd need to check it. However, I don't know that this creates a definite and obvious problem, because what you need to do is compensate people to the extent that they need in order to be compensated. So if it costs a lot to get them to give up the SUVs, pay that lot. And until I've checked the theory, I'm not sure whether the need to pay them more than they would have been willing to pay to get the SUV in the first place actually destroys the conclusion that everybody could be made better off by this process. There's no convincing people. You're not going to convince them that they're better off. The idea is you just pay them until they are better off, however much it takes. You pay people to reduce their emissions. We were thinking of it in a different way, but there are different ways of implementing this scheme. One is to have a carbon tax and compensate people for the carbon tax. Another one is simply to pay people a particular price for reducing their emissions. And you pay whatever it takes to get them to reduce their emissions. So I'm not sure, but that's not definitely a problem, though it may be one.
So there's the frog in the water theorem, that if you do things slowly enough, people won't notice it. I don't know if that's a theorem, but it's a folk theorem. And so I do wonder whether if you're concerned about this, I don't know what the behavioral psychology of this says, but that might be a reason to do it slowly, get people used to it, get people to think, hey, this is not really imposing anything, this is actually a good thing. But the idea of doing this slowly and gradually and ramping it up gradually over time rather than whacking them all at once at the beginning, I think this I don't know whether this would actually be validated by psychological experiments, but it might be.
We have 3 more in the queue, and if we're efficient, we can get through them without disrupting the schedule.
All right, I have a question for Professor Broome, although the other 2 folks might want to weigh in too. I have some concerns about the way that you've described the compensation plan. So that you described it as fixing the climate change problem in a way that's good for all of us, including future generations, and a plan that involved no sacrifice for anyone. So here's an example to illustrate what I'm worried about. Say I break into your house and I steal all your stuff, but I leave you 1 spoon. And you complain, you say, oh, you've made me worse off, all my stuff is gone. And I say, well, I was going to break into your house anyway, but I left you 1 spoon. So you're better off than you would have been. So it's a win-win situation, really. Right now, you're going to complain about that because you think the baseline against which I should judge whether you're better off or worse off can't take as a given the fact that I've already decided to break into your house. And I'm worried that future generations might think of things the same way, that it's not fair of us to decide that business as usual is the baseline against which we judge whether they're better off or worse off, that we can't take as a given that we've decided to harm them, that there's something morally questionable about that.
I've got a quick answer. I agree. We've got this baseline. It's better relative to the baseline, but it's an immoral baseline. That's certainly true. But it's better than not doing anything and sticking to the immoral baseline.
I just wanted to point out there is reducing carbon emissions is not simply a matter of self-sacrifice for the future. For example, from a medical perspective, just emergency room visits in the United States for asthma are significantly higher, multiple times than other countries, largely because of pollution in the cities. So I think part of the problem is educating people to realize that at the rate we're breathing what we're putting out, we're actually harming ourselves, and the benefits could be immediately realizable if we were to reduce that. If you look at the situation, we have severely high rates of asthma. The obesity rates in the United States among kids and adults have doubled over the last 20 years, which means that we're going to have extremely expensive healthcare costs in the future because of that. So I think that by reducing carbon emissions sooner rather than later, we're going to improve quality of life. Each of these people who is home with an asthma exacerbation for a week or longer is not at work, not being productive, not out eating dinner at Real Seafood. There could be major benefits right now if we were to act on that.
There would be benefits for us in our lives if we reduced our emissions, but most greenhouse gases are not poisonous. I think nitrous oxide possibly might be, but the ones that we're talking about are not poisonous. They don't directly harm us. You know, other pollution certainly harmed us directly, but not the greenhouse gases. Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned ozone, low-level ozone. That is a greenhouse gas, so that is another one that's poisonous. But the ones that we're talking about are carbon dioxide and methane principally, and also to some extent nitrous oxide. And the carbon dioxide and the methane, so far as I know, are not toxic in any way.
Look, I guess that brings us to the end of our queue, so let us thank our symposiasts for a fantastic Tanner Symposium.